Narrative is one of the ways in which we speak, one of the large categories in which we think. Plot is its thread of design and its active shaping force, the product of our refusal to allow temporality to be meaningless, our stubborn insistence on making meaning in a world and in our lives. Peter Brooks, Reading for the Plot. When was the last time you read The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald? Was it in high school, or are you like me and reading it in college? Either way, chances are a lot of what you remember are the details, the symbolism, imagery, historical context, everything you've come to know and expect from English classrooms. I'm here to tell you there's another way. Sorta. You see, as I was reading the book, I felt more and more drawn to the story itself rather than all the tiny details that make it up. I loved how the plot moved along, and I loved some of the decisions made to make the narrative stand out. That's when I realized something that I hadn't even thought about in a long time. The fact that narrative and plot are both considered literary devices, and are actually separate things. That's why, when I had to come up with an idea for my final project for one of my classes, I decided to look deeper into the plot and narrative of Gatsby and see where it takes me. Before we begin, we'll obviously go more in depth later, but to give you a basic idea, plot is the interconnectedness of the story and how it ends up going from point A to point B, while narrative is the story itself and the decisions the author makes to tell the story. These sound like really simple, easy to understand ideas, and on the surface they are, and that's sort of why I'm talking about them. They seem so simple that people don't tend to discuss them. I want to look at the bigger picture. Won't you join me? Plot is so basic to our experience of reading, and indeed to our very articulation of experience in general, that criticism has often passed it over in silence, as too obvious to bear discussion. Yet, the obvious can often be the most interesting, as well as the most difficult, to talk about. Peter Brooks, Reading for the Plot. Plot is something that we as readers tend to overlook. When analyzing literature in classrooms, it tends to be the last thing on our mind. We focus instead on the tiny details and the other additions to the narrative. Tones, themes, symbolism. We know these words inside and out by this point, don't we? But plot is the driving force throughout most novels, and the fact that we simply ignore it in intellectual conversation is appalling to me. Plot is primarily responsible for the mass consumption of literature in our society. As Peter Brooks puts it, plot is why we read Jaws, but not Henry James. In other words, it's what readers find themselves wanting out of a good novel. Today, we're going to be going through each chapter of The Great Gatsby and talking about one or two important events in each of the 9 chapters that will cause ripples throughout the rest of the novel. To really give us some structure, let's use our favorite middle school friend, the plot diagram. If you aren't familiar with the plot diagram, you should be taken out back. Let me catch you up to speed. The plot diagram is a useful tool that organizes practically any novel into 5 neat sections. Some diagrams include more sections than others, but we'll just be focusing on the main 5. These sections are the exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, and the resolution. Look in most books, you'll be able to find this format pretty easily, and Gatsby is no exception. For the purposes of this video, chapters 1 to 3 are the exposition, chapters 4 to 5 are the rising action, chapters 6 to 7 are the climax, and chapters 8 to 9 are the falling action, and sort of the resolution. Together, we'll be detailing just how The Great Gatsby clearly outlines the diagram through these chapters and why I've classified them in this way. Chapter 1, as you might guess, holds some pretty important exposition for the novel. After all, this is where Nick Carraway is introduced as our narrator, something we are very much going to touch on later. Nick introduces us to the Eggs, 2 islands in New York that are separated by a bay, and where much of the story takes place. Just a bit of background, the book is set in the Roaring Twenties, and Nick is writing this 2 years after the events of the book. He has just moved to West Egg next to Jay Gatsby, who we actually don't meet for a while. He later goes to a dinner at his cousin Daisy's house, who lives on East Egg with her husband, Tom Buchanan. The first dinner introduces us not only to Daisy and Tom, but also Jordan Baker, a famous golfer and a good friend of Daisy's. These are most of the main characters of the book, and we get a look at a couple of their personalities and defining characteristics. Daisy is someone who Nick constantly holds in high regard. I looked back at my cousin, who began to ask questions in her low, thrilling voice. It was the kind of voice that the ear follows up and down as if each speech is an arrangement of notes that will never be played again. Tom is a big brute who has some less than desirable traits.
Have you read The Rise of the Colored Empires? by this fellow Goddard.
Everybody ought to read it.
The idea is
That it's up to us, the dominant race, to watch out, or these other races will have control of things.
This is also the first social scenario that we see Nick in, so it's interesting to see how he acts around other characters. It's also worth noting that basically every character in the book is rich, with the exception of Nick. He's still well off, but not nearly as wealthy as the others. Moving on, Chapter 2 is almost just as important. Tom convinces Nick to go to an impromptu party with him, and this is where we meet Myrtle, Tom's mistress. What? Are you telling me that this guy
To watch out, or these other races will have control of things.
is unfaithful to his wife? Anyways, obviously this is a huge moment that will have some major effects later on. Before the party, we also get to see a couple important things. Tom uses his brutishness and his power to threaten Wilson, Myrtle's husband, revealing more of his awfulness. We also see a strange billboard showing an advertisement for glasses with a man staring through them. These are the eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg. It's not super big, but it is something that will be brought up later. Moving on to the party itself, for a while it's actually a decent time. Myrtle's sister Catherine was brought for Nick to talk to, and another couple, Mr. and Mrs. McKee, are also there. Nick claims that this is only his second time ever being drunk, which, personally, I find incredibly hard to believe. Gatsby is also brought up here, and we're introduced to a bit of his character through gossip. No one seems to know where he comes from or how he got his money. After a while, Myrtle and Tom fight, and Tom casually breaks her nose with an open palm slap. Now sensing that the party was over, Nick and Mr. McKee leave together, and this is where we get the first slight hint that Nick isn't entirely straight. I was standing there beside his bed, and he was sitting up between the sheets, clad in his underwear, with a great portfolio in his hands. This is never explained nor brought up again, and it's just interesting and perhaps enlightening to some of his later actions. Yes, in case you didn't know, there are some homosexual undertones in this novel, but I won't be going too in-depth about them, unfortunately. Chapter 3 is the last of the exposition, and it's a big one. We finally meet Gatsby.
You see, I'm Gatsby. His smile was one of those rare smiles that you may come across 4 or 5 times in life.
He invites Nick to one of his huge parties, and it seems like everyone within a 50-mile radius has come to it. Meeting Gatsby is one of the main things that happens during this chapter, but we also see more of Jordan. Gatsby pulls her away towards the end, but we do just generally get to see more of her. A couple other small things are that the gossip surrounding Gatsby builds, strengthening the mystery around this figure of a man. We're also introduced to Owl Eyes, who is suspicious of Gatsby and the reality of his wealth. Chapter 4 is the beginning of the Rising action, and honestly, there isn't much that happens. Okay, well, that's sort of a lie, but there's only really 2 things that happen here, but they are pretty big. Gatsby tells Nick some of his backstory, or at the very least his cover-up. He claims that he was a prominent officer during the Great War, and shows Nick a medal to prove it, which Nick naively believes. He also tells him that he went to Oxford. Later on, Jordan reveals that Gatsby wants Nick to set up a tea date between him and Gatsby, because Gatsby is apparently in love with her. This is why he pulled her away during the last chapter. Now's just as good a time as any to tell you, Nick isn't the main character, despite the book being in first person from his perspective. Again, we'll touch on this a lot later, but it's worth noting now because Jordan, despite being a main character to some degree, doesn't do a whole lot besides being sort of a love interest to Nick. Being the middleman for Gatsby and Nick is her main purpose here, and that's just about it. Chapter 5 is where Nick, being the narrator, starts to show some noticeable consequences. But before we talk about that, this is where Gatsby and Daisy finally reunite after not seeing each other in years. At first, it's super awkward, but Nick decides to walk out and give them some space, and when he returns, he finds them talking, with tears of joy running down Daisy's cheeks, and Gatsby grinning like an idiot. Not being able to see their conversation is something huge that we are missing out because Nick is the narrator of this story. Eventually, they go to Gatsby's house and hang out, and Nick, once again, leaves to let them have some alone time. Chapter 6 is the slight continuation of the Rising action, while also being the beginning of the climax. If this is the climax, we're here. Right out of the gate, we get a huge info dump about Gatsby's actual past. He was initially just a poor young boy named James Gatz, who was working and noticed a yacht out in the water near where he worked, and rode out there to tell whoever was on it that a storm was coming. The yacht was owned by Dan Cody, a copper mogul. He took Gatsby under his wing as his assistant, and this is where Gatsby learned an appreciation for the finer things in life. The name J. Gatsby is what he gave Cody when he first met him, and it represented everything he wanted in the world. A character trait of Gatsby's is that he doesn't drink, even at his parties, and this job is why, since he would have to take care of Cody whenever he was wasted. When Cody died, Gatsby was supposed to get $25,000, but through some legal loophole, Cody's mistress got it instead. Gatsby was back to being a poor young boy, and he wasn't going to let that stand. Now, immediately, something doesn't seem right here. Why are we being told all of this now? It was only 2 chapters ago that Gatsby told us his cover-up. Well, Nick, and by extension Fitzgerald, decided that now would be a good time to tell us, but he himself wasn't told until a later chapter. He says that his reasoning for doing this is he wants to put rest the rumors and gossip about Gatsby. While we're dismissing rumors, now is a good time to point out that Gatsby is a bootlegger, and this is how he got his money. We don't see this confirmed until later on, but it's relatively not a huge point compared to everything else that happens, so I just put it here. This puts us closer to the falling action than the rising, and is a slight detour from the prescribed outline of the plot diagram. One small thing that is like the bubble about to pop onto the climax is that Tom came with Daisy to one of Gatsby's parties. Tom is growing more and more suspicious of Daisy and Gatsby. Moving on, Chapter 7 is the real climax. For lack of a better phrase, this is where shit really hits the fan, at least in my opinion. Nick goes to Daisy and Tom's house once again for dinner, and this time Gatsby is there along with Jordan. Then something happens that changes the course of the rest of the story. Tom finds out about Daisy and Gatsby.
She had told Gatsby that she loved him, and Tom had seen.
Tom is struggling hard to keep in his rage, and Daisy suggests they go to the city to cool off on such a hot day, and Tom jumps on this opportunity. They find a hotel room in the city, and this is where everything falls apart. Desperate for a confrontation, Tom teases Gatsby about going to Oxford like he claims, and eventually Gatsby explains that he can't call himself an Oxford man, because he only went there for 5 months in a program with the military. The tension in the room releases a bit, but Tom isn't done. "Wait a minute," snapped Tom. "I want to ask Mr. Gatsby one more question." "Go on," said Gatsby politely. "What kind of row are you trying to cause in my house anyhow?" They were out in the open at last, and Gatsby was content. "He isn't causing a row." Daisy looked desperate from one to the other. "You're causing a row. Please, have a little self-control." "Self-control?" repeated Tom incredulously. "I suppose the latest thing is to sit back and let Mr. Nobody from nowhere make love to your wife. Well, if that's the idea, you can count me out. Nowadays, people begin by sneering at family life and family institutions. The next, they'll throw everything overboard and have intermarriage between black and white." Flushed with his impassioned gibberish, he saw himself standing alone in the last barrier of civilization. "We're all white here," murmured Jordan. Tom's now infamous speech triggered Gatsby's anger, as well as everyone else's. Then Gatsby proceeds to make the biggest mistake he could ever make. He tells Tom to his face that Daisy never loved him, and that she loved Gatsby instead, and always has. He proceeds to try to force Daisy to agree with him, which, although she does at first, she goes back on and tells him that of course at one point she was in love with Tom. Tom, knowing that he won, tells Daisy and Gatsby to ride home together, as a show of victory. They do, and then the other 3 follow them, only to find a horrible sight. Myrtle, Tom's mistress, had been run over by a car. Gatsby's signature yellow car. It truly is a gruesome sight, and everyone is freaking out. Wilson is broken beyond repair, and Tom isn't in a much better state. After the group gets back to Daisy's house, Gatsby is waiting in the bushes in case Tom does something to her. Gatsby explains that he had actually let Daisy drive the car, and that she had accidentally ran over Myrtle, and that he was willing to take the blame for her. Nick sees Tom and Daisy sitting at their dining room table talking before he leaves. After that roller coaster of events, Chapter 8 doesn't hold back either. Gatsby comes home and Nick goes to meet him. This is where Gatsby initially tells Nick his true origins, as well as telling him that Daisy was supposed to wait for him after the war, but she married Tom instead because Gatsby was stuck at Oxford and she wanted Tom's social status. Nick tells him that people think he killed someone, and people being Tom, he needed to get the hell out of Dodge. Gatsby can't imagine a life without Daisy and refuses. A servant later comes up to them and tells Gatsby that he plans on emptying out the pool. Gatsby tells Nick how funny he finds it, that all summer he had never used it. Well, goodbye. We shook hands and I started away. Just before I reached the hedge, I remembered something and turned around. "They're a rotten crowd," I shouted across the lawn. "You're worth the whole damn bunch put together." I've always been glad I said that. It was the only compliment I ever gave him, because I disapproved of him from beginning to end. Wilson, distraught by his wife's death, stares into the eyes of T.J. Eckelberg, and thinking them to be God's eyes telling him to get revenge, he looks for the person who drives a bright yellow car. Eventually, he finds Gatsby at his house, and as Gatsby lays in an air mattress in his pool, Wilson shoots him, and then himself. Despite the titular character dying, I don't consider this the climax like others might. This is all as a result of what happened in the previous chapter, and throughout the chapter, it's pretty clear that things are going to be different from then on out. It's just that no one knew how. Believe it or not, the final chapter is actually more of the falling action. I'll explain in a minute. Nick somehow finds himself to be the only one who is interested in Gatsby's funeral. None of Gatsby's many acquaintances wanted to be there, and Daisy and Tom had left before Gatsby was even shot. Kind of a side tangent, but this fact pisses me off to no end. It is so angering to me that Daisy just up and left Gatsby. I believe the reason for this is Gatsby telling her to say that she never loved Tom. If he had never done that, maybe she would have never left. Regardless, they were gone, and Nick, along with Henry Gatz, Jay's father, were the only one to attend the funeral. Owl Eyes also shows up later on, which is kind of weird, but it happens. Nick was Gatsby's only true friend, despite Nick claiming he disapproved of him. Jordan and Nick officially break up, and Nick moves back to the Midwest. Before he moves, Nick actually sees Tom again, and initially refuses to shake his hand, which is immensely satisfying. He finds himself pitying him, and he feels like he was talking to a child. Tom also admits that he was the one who told Wilson who owned the yellow car. And so it ends. Gatsby dead, Daisy and Tom gone, and Nick leaving it all behind him. Previously, I had thought that the resolution would have been the funeral. After all, Nick is the only one of the group left, and he leaves himself after the funeral. I would like to dispute this, however, and say that the true resolution is actually revealed at the very beginning of the novel. It's acknowledged many times that Nick is actively recalling and writing down the story. It's clear to me that this is something that sticks with Nick, something that he felt he had to write down. I propose that the true resolution, at least for Nick, is when he finishes the story and is finally able to put it behind him for real. This is naturally another attack on our beloved plot diagram, but we'll make an exception, just this once. So, what exactly was my point here? Did I not just give you a summary of the book you probably already read? Well, once again quoting Booth, plot is the principle of interconnectedness and intention which we cannot do without in moving through the discrete elements, incidents, episodes, actions of a narrative. Essentially, plot is how the story is structured and how events connect with each other. What I'm trying to get across is how everything builds on the previous events. Let me give a brief example to really drive this home. I feel as if the best character to really show what I'm talking about is Tom Buchanan. We meet him right in the first chapter, and we know exactly the kind of person he is right off the bat. A racist brute who is simply unlikable. In Chapter 2, we see this developed even more with the threatening of Wilson and the breaking of Myrtle's nose. Speaking of Myrtle, this is when she gets introduced, and immediately it is clear that she's going to be an important driving force for Tom's character. Chapter 6 is when we next see Tom, jumping straight into the climax. He accompanies Daisy to one of Gatsby's parties since he doesn't trust her to be on her own. By this point, the audience saw Daisy and Gatsby's reunion, so the irony is palpable for Tom. He's cheating on his wife, and his wife's cheating on him, but although he's suspicious, he doesn't really know anything. It truly seems like poetic justice for a character like him. That is, until we reach Chapter 7. Tom finally finds out about Gatsby and Daisy, and he's trying not to blow up immediately. Somehow, despite cheating on his wife himself, he is still foaming at the mouth at this revelation. he still cares about Daisy as his wife, despite what his actions say. Something I didn't mention before is while Tom, Nick, and Jordan are riding to the hotel, they stop at the gas station that Wilson owns, and he tells Tom that he and Myrtle are moving away. Tom is now losing his wife to Mr. Nobody, and his mistress is leaving town. The two women in his life that he cares the most about are about to be gone. During the confrontation, Tom goes back to his ramblings about race from the first chapter. It's only after Gatsby makes his grave mistake that Tom feels he has won. Because of this, he knows neither Gatsby nor Daisy will try anything funny and sends them back home together. This, you might say, ends up being Tom's grave mistake. As we know, Daisy ends up killing Myrtle, and Tom's horrified. It's pretty clear at this moment that Tom truly cared about her. This has broken him. Back at his house, we don't know what he and Daisy talk about, but the next day, they're gone. We only see Tom one more time after the funeral. Nick confronts him about Wilson, and Tom admits that he told him who owned the car. At first, he's defending himself, but then pauses and starts saying he feels no remorse because Gatsby killed Myrtle. What if I did tell him? That fellow had it coming to him. He threw dust in your eyes just like he did in Daisy's, but he was a rough one. He ran over Myrtle like he'd run over a dog, and never even stopped his car. There was nothing I could say, except the one unutterable fact that it wasn't true. The true poetic justice is that he felt no remorse in sentencing a man to death for a crime that his own wife had committed. Tom goes on to say that he cried like a baby after being reminded of Myrtle while he went up to give up the flat that he had their party in. Nick then says he feels like he's talking to a child and ends the conversation. This is one character out of the plenty that we see throughout the book. I could just as easily go through Nick's story, or Gatsby's, or any of the others, and each one would have its own build-up and payoff. Maybe with the exception of Jordan. It's the culmination of all the characters' build-up and payoff that makes the story so satisfying. Gatsby ends up giving his life for the girl he loves. Nick devotes his time to making sure the mystery of a man that he claims not to like has a proper funeral. Daisy leaves Gatsby behind, not even acknowledging the sacrifice he made for her. These are all integral pieces to the puzzle of Gatsby's plot, and it's why I love it so much. Gatsby believed in the green light, the orgastic future that year by year recedes before us. It eluded us then, but that's no matter. Tomorrow we will run faster, stretch out our arms farther, and one fine morning. So we beat on, boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past. The Great Gatsby. Narrative is a huge topic that has an entire field of study, narratology. If I sat here and dove into each aspect of narratology and how it relates to The Great Gatsby, we would be here for literal hours. Narratology refers to the study of the narrative itself, as well as the decisions the author makes in order to effectively tell the story, as well as how the audience reacts to these decisions. Let me give an example. The Rhetoric of Fiction by Wayne C. Booth defines 3 different types of literary interest. I won't go too deep into this because this isn't quite what I want to focus on, but the 3 types are intellectual/cognitive, the reader always wants to know the facts; qualitative, the reader wants to experience the development of certain qualities; and practical, the reader has a strong desire to see their favorite characters succeed and their least favorite fail. This is something that we as readers can resonate with as something we may not actively feel, but is something we can recognize our minds pulling towards. For intellectual interest, this is pretty simple. Particularly because of the gossip and mystery surrounding Gatsby, we want to know more about him. We want to know how the story ends. We want to know what happens. For qualitative, it's a bit more complicated. Booth outlines several different versions of qualitative interest, but for our purposes, let's just select one. Promised qualities are more so qualities you come to expect out of the writing itself. For example, Nick often has an air of sarcasm around him. The line, flushed with his impassioned gibberish, he saw himself standing alone in the last barrier of civilization, perfectly outlines this. The more we see it in the novel, the more we come to expect this as if it's promised to us. Practical is pretty self-explanatory. In the novel, we tend to want Gatsby to succeed in his endeavors with Daisy because we tend to like him as a character and find ourselves rooting for him. Conversely, we really don't want to see Tom win because he shows just how awful he is on multiple occasions, and we tend to want to see him get his poetic justice, as I pointed out earlier. This is all just one way of looking at the narrative of Gatsby, but there's another one I'd like to focus on even more. 3 words. Point of view. Connor, didn't you say you wanted to avoid all the details we talk about in class all the time? Doesn't point of view fall into that category? Well, yes, but also no. Point of view tends to be one of the broader topics we talk about in a classroom, and it's because it is so important to every single reading you do, fiction, nonfiction, literally anything. Who is speaking is integral to understanding truly what the whole thing is about. For example, you might not read a political article from Fox News, but you might from CNN about the same topic, simply because of who is writing the article. Novels are no different. Who the narrator is incredibly important. Once again, going back to Booth, he outlines quite a few different types of narrators, and he outright calls out Nick as being a narrator agent. A narrator agent is someone who has some level of effect on the narrative itself, although, almost comically to me, he says that Nick has a relatively minor impact on the narrative, although this is something I tend to disagree with. Nick, being the narrator, is primarily what I'd like to focus on today. First, let's talk about the elephant in the room. The narrator is not the main character. Nick Carraway is not so much writing about his own life as he is writing about the life of Jay Gatsby. His reasoning for doing so is not spelled out for us, but as I mentioned earlier, I suspect he felt he needed to get the story off his chest for whatever reason, presumably because he knows the true killer Myrtle and never said anything. This is not an uncommon thought to have. In fact, the movie plays into this idea a little bit more, having Nick writing his book in a psychiatric hospital. Normally, when thinking about a story in the first-person perspective, we tend to think of the narrator as being the person the story is about, but this isn't the case here. Because of this, we get a perspective that we might not otherwise get. For example, think about how the book and the story would have been changed had Daisy been the narrator. For one, we would have been there during her and Gatsby's reunion, and we would have been there when she killed Myrtle. We might have felt her guilt at the murder and her frustration at Gatsby forcing her to say that she never loved her own husband, as well as learning about how he actually makes his money. And what about Gatsby? Well, we might have found out his true origins a hell of a lot sooner. Also, we would have known exactly what he was thinking at all times. Perhaps his grave mistake might have been more logical in his eyes, and his obsession might have been more explained. Most interestingly, imagine how the book would have been different if Tom had been the narrator. No doubt we as the audience would sympathize with him more, especially towards the end. After all, Mr. Nobody from nowhere is sleeping with his wife. Naturally, the racism probably would still not sit well with the audience, but that's only assuming the character would stay the exact same. After all, in this scenario, it's Tom telling the story. I mean, personally, if I was writing a book about something that happened to me, and I wanted the reader to sympathize with me, I probably would leave out any and all racist remarks I make, simply to get the reader more on my side. And that brings me to my next point, reliability. Nick is wholeheartedly an unreliable narrator. There are some that disagree with this statement, but I, along with Thomas E. Boyle, as well as countless others, stand our ground. Boyle's unreliable narration in The Great Gatsby, a title that well explains his point, provides some evidence here. Something I find particularly entertaining about this piece of writing is how angry the author seems by the idea that Nick is a reliable narrator. Gatsby. I am the son of some wealthy people in the Middle West. Carraway. What part of the Middle West? Gatsby. San Francisco. Nick's response is, I see. What in fact does Nick see? Is our response to Gatsby's unbelievable ignorance of geography the same as the narrator's? So far as I know, the only comment on this passage sees it as an aspect of the ridiculous. Whatever that means. I just find that section hilarious, but he does make a good point. In this section of the article, Boyle is describing Nick's tendency for compromise, and that he thinks the easiest way to do things is the best way to do them. He also notes earlier that Nick is simply a hypocrite in many ways, and is more immoral than he seems at first glance. Nick has a set of values that he lives by, and has values that he finds reprehensible in others. But he displays some of these himself. Boyle points out that despite him touting tolerant beliefs, he sees 3 black men in the back of a limo driven by a white driver and thinks, anything can happen now. Immorality isn't necessarily something we tend to look for in an unreliable narrator, but hypocrisy certainly is. If a narrator isn't following along to his own self-proclaimed beliefs, how can we trust him to give us reliable information? Another point against his morality comes from the fact that he literally was an accomplice to Daisy's murder. Just a thought I should throw in. Nick believes that life is much more successfully looked at from a single window, and that window is framed by his shallowness, hypocrisy, immorality, and compromise. Something else that I noticed when I first read, but Boyle had the courage to actually point out, is that Nick is also in love with Daisy, his cousin. I'll let that sink in for a second. But in all honesty, it makes perfect sense. As I stated towards the beginning of the video, Nick constantly praises Daisy as being someone held in high regard. But there's one thing that seems incredibly odd knowing what we know. Nick is writing this book 2 years after the events of the novel. So what does that mean? He knows Daisy murdered someone. He knows she left Gatsby without looking back. Why on earth would he hold her in such high regard for 95% of the book? And no, it isn't the same as someone objectively setting up the scene that everyone loved her because of the way she was, and that's why it was so heartbreaking. No, his writing is very much personal and doting. This fact alone is what solidifies him being an unreliable narrator for me. The way he talks about Daisy the entire time is inexcusable, unless he was in love with her or at least held a large amount of fondness for her. And even then, it's not really excusable, it's just more understandable, I guess. This quote alone, that Boyle also uses, is a perfect example of this. For a moment, the last sunshine fell with romantic affection upon her glowing face. Her voice compelled me forward breathlessly as I listened. Are you about to tell me that these are the words of a man talking about his fucking cousin? Okay, alright. I'm calm. So, once again, what am I getting at? Well, think about how different the book would be if the narrator was different in any way. Whether it be a different character, or if Nick was actually reliable and we could trust what he says. It's worth noting that there are a few moments that Nick wasn't there for as well, such as Wilson's sudden want for revenge. He was told about this by other characters, I believe, but that doesn't mean he knew exactly what happened, and yet that's how he tells it. He also is remembering this after 2 years after the actual events. Naturally, his memory isn't going to be what it was like 6 months afterwards. Something I also brought up earlier is the notion that the impromptu party with Tom and Myrtle was only the second time he'd ever been drunk, something I find incredibly hard to believe. The trust between the narrator and the reader means a lot, since it delegates how much a reader feels the need to read between the lines, or just in general, how they view the story, since we pretty much have to view it through the eyes of the narrator, reliable or otherwise. As I stated in the beginning, I wanted to look at the bigger picture of Gatsby and show you that there's another way to look at books than just through the details. I think we all tend to focus too much on them and miss what people really read books for. Forgive me for the pronunciation of this name, but as Thomas M. Leach writes in his For Against, A Theory of Rereading, there is merit in reading something for the first time and enjoying the simple pleasures of it. When we reread something over and over again, we tend to want to find more and dig deeper into it, which has bled into classrooms as teachers read and teach the same novels repeatedly. I propose that we allow ourselves to properly read a book for its simple pleasures, and quite frankly, enjoy it. Repeated rereadings bring other tropes into prominence and make plot and character correspondingly less important, hence the pedagogical prejudice in favor of analyzing image and structure, instead of simply reading for the plot. Thomas M. Leach, For Against, A Theory of Rereading. And that's pretty much it. Let's be honest here. The things we talked about today weren't rocket science. Compared to some other literary elements that we tend to dive into, like historical context or connection to the author, this was all relatively tame. However, we did just spend about 35 minutes talking about these things. And we didn't even scratch the surface. There are so many examples and topics I could have talked about, but I spared you my ramblings. My overall point here is that sometimes we as readers and analysts need to take a step back and look at the bigger picture. Instead of bringing a magnifying glass, bring a telescope every once in a while. I find the bigger picture sometimes way more interesting than the details personally, especially when it's a story as good as The Great Gatsby. I hope you all enjoyed. As I said in the beginning, I made this mostly for a class project, so chances are I probably won't make another video like this again unless it somehow gets really popular. Before I end things off, I just want to make one big recommendation for another book if you liked Gatsby. It's called Self-Made Boys, A Great Gatsby Remix by Anna Marie McLemore. It's a retelling of Gatsby where Nick is canonically gay for Gatsby, and both of them are transgender, as well as Nick being Latino. It brings a ton of new perspectives into the original story that are missing, not just the rich white side. I honestly love the book, and Nick is so much better than how he is in the original. I promise. Just go check it out if you have a chance. A little less formal here. I'm posting this on a channel that's going to be changing very soon. I plan on uploading videos about music analysis rather than the gaming videos I've been doing recently. Although my videos will still be gaming related, I mostly plan on analyzing video game music. It's just, this channel is going to be changing, so I'm sorry if this is the first time you're seeing one of my videos and you want to see more of me, because the format is probably going to change to some degree. I haven't fully decided on a name for the channel yet. I'm still working on the rebranding process, so when that happens, just come back and you'll find out. Subscribe if you want to find out what I do in the future. I don't think I have a whole lot else to say. So I hope you as the audience enjoyed watching this, and I hope you enjoyed it as well, Professor. See you all later.